I'm still haunted by what I saw on those tapes. But I guess I should start from the beginning, right? Because how I even ended up there in that attic staring into the horror of those VHS tapes. Well, it's something I could never have seen coming. Started like any other afternoon. I was at my grandmother's house, helping her move around some old furniture. She'd been my rock since my mother passed when I was just a kid, and after my accident, she'd been the one to pull me through the worst of it. Her house was where I was recovering, both physically and mentally. I felt like I owed her everything, so I'd spend time helping her with anything she needed. This particular day, she asked me to help with some boxes up in the attic. I was hauling boxes around when I accidentally knocked one over, tumbled to the ground, and out spilled a stack of old VHS tapes. They were covered in dust, their labels faded. Each one had nothing but a year written on it. The oldest was marked 1990. Curiosity got the better of me, and since we had an old TV and VHS player up there, I figured, why not? So, I popped in the oldest tape expecting maybe a home video. But what I saw was nothing close to that. It started out innocently enough. The camera was shaky, like it was hidden. Someone was filming a woman sitting alone at a small table in a coffee shop. She was reading, oblivious to whoever was watching her. The camera lingered, zoomed in too close, capturing the light glinting off her hair. It was unsettling, like I was peering into something I wasn't supposed to see. But before I could make sense of it, the scene shifted. Now, the woman was walking down a busy street. It was nighttime, the sky heavy and gray. She was still being followed, only now she seemed to sense it. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but whoever was filming stayed just out of sight. I felt my stomach twist as I realized the person behind the camera was stalking her. It wasn't just a passerby, this was deliberate. Then the footage jumped again. She was now in the trunk of a car. I could hear the rain pouring down, could barely make out her muffled cries through the heavy tape over her mouth. My hands went cold. I was glued to the screen, watching as a gloved hand reached into the trunk, slamming it shut with a metallic thud. I wanted to stop the tape, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, horrified yet unable to tear my eyes away. The scene cut again. Now, she was in a warehouse, tied to a chair, bloody, slumped forward under a single hanging light. It was as if every beat of her life had been meticulously captured on tape. Leading up to, I didn't want to imagine what was next. I couldn't look away, even though I knew I should have stopped. Every nerve in my body screamed to eject the tape, to turn off the TV, to forget I'd ever seen any of it. But I was transfixed, paralyzed with dread, as the grainy footage continued. In the warehouse, the woman barely moved. Her head drooped forward, her hair matted with blood. The camera was set down, no longer in shaky hands but steadied on a surface. I could hear the soft sound of footsteps echoing off the concrete, someone shifting nearby, just out of view. Then a figure stepped into the frame. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a black balaclava. He held something in his hand, a blade that glinted under the sickly fluorescent light. He moved methodically, as if he'd done this before, as if he had rehearsed it. He walked behind the woman, grabbing her by the chin, forcing her face up to meet the camera. She was barely conscious, her eyes unfocused, but the fear was still there, deep in her gaze. Then, with a terrifying calmness, he dragged the blade across her throat. The scene unfolded in excruciating detail, the blood pooling around her feet, her life slipping away with each agonized breath. And then, in one smooth motion, he stepped back, wiped the blade on a cloth, and turned to face the camera. That's when he pulled off the mask. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my ears as his face came into view. He looked straight into the lens, unblinking, with a chilling smile spreading across his face. He held that smile, a cruel, mocking grin, before he leaned forward, bringing his face close to the camera as if he were looking directly at me. The screen went black. I sat there, my blood running cold, the room dead silent. But before I could process what I'd just seen, the TV flickered back to life. This time it was daytime. The camera was in the hands of someone else, clearly shaky, panning around the neighborhood I recognized as my grandmother's. My mind was spinning. How could this be? The camera panned slowly around the street, capturing details that felt disturbingly familiar. The weathered houses, the old oak trees lining the road, even the cracked pavement that led right up to my grandmother's doorstep. Every instinct screamed at me to turn off the TV, but my hand wouldn't obey. It hovered near the remote, paralyzed. The footage moved closer, zooming in on my grandmother's house. I could see her mailbox, the one I'd helped her repaint last summer. Whoever was filming was getting closer. The camera shook slightly, as if the person holding it was excited or nervous. It came right up to her front steps, then paused, the lens settling on the front door for an agonizing few seconds before the scene cut to black. A breath I didn't know I'd been holding rushed out of me. The screen stayed dark for a moment, long enough for me to start to believe it was over. But then the screen blinked back on. The scene was now inside the house. My stomach flipped as I recognized the hallway, the faded wallpaper, the coat rack by the door. The camera moved slowly, deliberately, down the corridor, each step matching the creak of the old floorboards. I felt as if I were watching my own memories play out on the screen, each detail too accurate, too personal. The footage continued down the hallway, passing the family photos on the wall, photos of me, my grandmother, even my mother. The lens paused on a picture of me as a kid, smiling at the camera, clueless and innocent. Then, with a shaky breath, I realized something else. The picture had been taken in the same attic I was sitting in now. I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there. The film cut to a new shot. Now, the camera was in my grandmother's living room, focused on her armchair. She sat there, oblivious, knitting quietly with the sunlight filtering in through the window. She looked peaceful, but whoever was filming stayed out of her line of sight, creeping forward, inching closer, until they were standing just behind her. The camera stayed there, hovering over her shoulder, watching her in eerie silence. She continued to knit, completely unaware of the presence lurking just inches away. And then, in a voice so low I almost missed it, I heard a whisper. A man's voice, close enough that it sent a chill down my spine. "See you soon." The screen went black again. I sat frozen, my hand gripping the edge of the chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The silence in the attic felt oppressive, as if the air itself were pressing down on me. That whisper echoed in my head, "See you soon," each syllable laced with an unspeakable promise. I wanted to scream, to run down the stairs and get as far away as possible, but I was rooted in place. My mind raced through the possibilities. Who was this person? How long had they been watching us? And why had my grandmother kept these tapes hidden in a dusty old box? My hands trembled as I reached for another tape, almost on autopilot, needing answers but dreading what I might find. I slid the next tape into the player, my fingers barely functioning. The screen flickered to life, showing the inside of a dimly lit room. Took me a second to recognize it, but then it hit me like a punch to the gut. This was the attic, the very room I was sitting in. The footage was older, grainier, like it had been filmed years ago. The camera panned slowly around the room, settling on the very chair I was sitting in now. My breath hitched. It was as if someone had captured the scene decades before, knowing that one day, I'd be sitting in that exact spot, watching this exact footage. Then, the camera moved closer, zooming in on the floorboards near the corner of the room. I watched as the person behind the lens reached down, their hand appearing in the frame. They tapped lightly on one of the boards, then pried it up, revealing a small, hidden compartment. My heart pounded as I glanced toward the same spot in the attic. Could it really be there? I turned back to the screen, and there it was, a small, leather-bound notebook nestled in the hidden compartment. The person on the tape opened it, revealing pages and pages of scribbled notes, symbols, and drawings that seemed to tell a story of their own. My pulse quickened as I strained to make out the words. Suddenly, the person's hand froze, and the camera tilted slightly as if they'd heard something. I held my breath, watching as they slowly turned the camera around to face the attic entrance. For a moment, there was nothing, just darkness and the faint creaking of the house settling. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. An old man, with deep-set eyes and a twisted smile, standing at the entrance of the attic. He stared directly into the camera, his eyes full of something dark, something malevolent. He took a step forward and the screen cut to static. I bolted upright, staring at the spot where the hidden compartment should be. I had to know if it was real, if that notebook was still there, if this wasn't just some twisted trick of my imagination. My breath was shallow, and my hands shook as I reached the corner of the attic where the person on the tape had pried up the floorboard. Part of me desperately wanted to leave it alone, to turn and run down the stairs, maybe even leave the house entirely. But the other part, the part that had already seen too much, that needed to understand this nightmare, pushed me forward. I knelt down, feeling around the floor for the loose board. My fingers brushed against an edge that seemed slightly raised. With a gulp, I wedged my fingers under it and lifted. The board came up easily, revealing a dusty, dark space beneath. My heart hammered as I reached in and felt something cool and smooth. A small, leather-bound notebook, just like in the video. I pulled it out, wiping the dust off the cover. My hands trembled as I opened it, flipping through page after page of hastily scrawled notes. Symbols I didn't recognize, drawings that seemed chaotic, frantic. There were maps of our neighborhood, pages filled with detailed descriptions of daily routines, my grandmother's, my own, even our neighbors'. The writing became increasingly erratic, barely legible, each entry marked by dates spanning years. And then I found it, an entry marked with today's date. My blood ran cold as I read the words. She'll find the tapes today. She won't be able to resist watching them. They always watch them. A creeping dread washed over me as I continued to read. She'll find the notebook. It's time she knew the truth. It's time she understood what's coming. Tonight, it will all come full circle. The words were smeared, as if written in a frenzy, and on the following pages, the handwriting grew even more disjointed, devolving into cryptic phrases and ominous warnings. Asterisk, the watcher in the shadows. They are already here. Do not trust your own eyes. Asterisk. I slammed the notebook shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some old journal. It was a sick blueprint, a timeline of everything that had led to this moment. To me, sitting here in the attic, notebook in hand, terrified out of my mind. A faint creak sounded from downstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened. The house was old, so creaks weren't unusual, but this felt different. It was deliberate, like a soft, careful step on the wooden floorboards below. Someone was in the house. I clutched the notebook to my chest, my heart racing. I forced myself to stand, inching toward the door of the attic. The creaks grew louder, heading up the stairs, slow and steady. I glanced around, desperately trying to figure out what to do. Hide? Confront whoever or whatever was coming up those stairs? I didn't even have anything to defend myself with. As the footsteps reached the top of the staircase, I could see a shadow stretching across the wall outside the attic door. The shadow was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to extend far longer than they should. My mind raced back to the figure I'd seen on the tape. That old man with the twisted smile, staring into the camera with those dark, predatory eyes. The attic door creaked open, just an inch, and I held my breath, backing away until I was pressed against the far wall. Through the crack, I could see a hand, gnarled and pale, with fingers so thin they looked almost skeletal, reaching inside to push the door open wider. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will myself invisible, hoping whoever it was wouldn't see me if I just stayed silent. But then I heard a voice, soft, raspy, barely more than a whisper. I knew you'd come. I've been waiting a long time. My eyes snapped open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, the same man from the tape. His face was twisted into that same unsettling smile, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement as he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out barely a whisper. Who are you? Why are you doing this? He tilted his head, his smile widening. You're just like the others. So curious, so eager to see what you shouldn't. He took another step, his gaze drifting down to the notebook clutched in my hands. You found it, didn't you? All the answers are in there. I glanced down at the notebook, feeling a surge of dread as his words sank in. He had planned this. Every moment, every discovery. He had been guiding me toward it. Why me? I asked, my voice trembling. His expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. Because you're the last to know, the last to see. And now, the last to disappear. He lunged forward, faster than I could have anticipated. I stumbled backward, clutching the notebook as I turned to run. I managed to dodge around him, scrambling out of the attic and down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. The house seemed to twist and warp around me as I ran, the walls narrowing, the hallway stretching longer than it should. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, slow and steady, echoing through the house as he followed, his laughter low and sinister. I burst through the front door and into the night, gasping for air as I stumbled onto the lawn. I turned back, expecting to see him at the door, but there was nothing. Just the silent, empty house, dark and still as if nothing had happened. I clutched the notebook tightly, its pages heavy with the weight of all those twisted secrets. I didn't know what to do, where to go. But as I turned and started down the street, one thing became chillingly clear. This wasn't over. I ran down the street, every shadow feeling like it could morph into him, every sound echoing his slow, steady footsteps. The notebook felt like it was burning in my hands, but I didn't dare let it go. It was my only link to whatever was going on, maybe even my only chance to survive. I reached the end of the block and ducked into a small park, hiding behind a cluster of trees. My breathing was ragged, and my mind was racing. What now? Go to the police? How could I explain what had happened without sounding insane? I flipped open the notebook, hoping it might give me a clue, anything that could make sense of what I'd seen. My fingers shook as I turned to the last few pages, and there, in the same messy scrawl, I found another entry. My stomach dropped as I read. She'll try to run. They always do, but she can't escape what's been set in motion. I let out a choked gasp, slamming the notebook shut. Somehow, he'd predicted everything, every reaction I'd have. But how? Was he watching me even now? I forced myself to calm down, focusing on the one thing I knew. He wasn't just some ghost or figment of my imagination. He was real, flesh and blood, and that meant he could be stopped. I took a few deep breaths, gathering my resolve, and made my way back out of the park. I couldn't go back to my grandmother's house, not with him lurking around. But there was one place I could go, where I knew I'd be safe for the night. An old childhood friend's house just a few blocks away. I hadn't seen him in years, but I knew he'd help. The streets were eerily quiet as I walked, and every flickering streetlight, every darkened alley, felt like it was hiding something. When I finally reached my friend's house, I banged on the door, my eyes darting around, half expecting that figure to appear in the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and he stood there, bleary-eyed and confused. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, noticing the wild look in my eyes. I forced a shaky smile. "Can I crash here tonight?" It's a long story. He didn't press me, just nodded and let me in. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I stepped inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary reprieve. After he set up the couch for me, I settled in, clutching the notebook close, my mind racing too much to even consider sleeping. That's when I heard it, a faint tap at the window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned to look, my blood running cold as I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside the glass. It was him, the man from the tape with that twisted smile plastered on his face, staring directly at me. He lifted a finger to his lips, a silent shushing gesture, before tapping the glass again, the sound slow, deliberate. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. He leaned closer, his eyes boring into mine, and mouthed two words. "Found you." I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table, as my friend rushed into the room, alarmed by the noise. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I pointed to the window, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Just the empty yard, silent and undisturbed. I felt a chill run down my spine as my friend looked back at me, his face full of concern. I think I'm being followed," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't question me, just nodded, his face serious. "Let's call the police," he said, grabbing his phone. For a moment, I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe they could help. Maybe this nightmare would finally end. But then, as he dialed, I noticed something scrawled on the back of the notebook. There, in the same messy handwriting, were two new words, as if they'd been written only moments before. "Too late." My heart plummeted as I stared at those words. Too late, they were fresh, the ink still wet, smudging slightly as I touched the page. My friend was on the phone, explaining that someone was stalking me, but all I could focus on was the ominous message. How had it appeared? I hadn't seen anyone touch the notebook. Was he in the house, watching us right now? The police said they'd send someone over. My friend assured me I'd be safe, trying to calm me down, but nothing could quiet the dread coiling in my gut. We waited in tense silence, the minutes dragging on, both of us on edge. I clutched the notebook tightly, feeling its weight as if it were a living thing, pulsing in my hands. Then the doorbell rang. My friend jumped up, rushing to the door. Relief washed over me. Help had arrived. I could finally explain everything, show them the notebook, tell them about the man, the tapes, everything. I stood up, ready to meet the officers, but as my friend opened the door, a chill ran through me. Standing there was a single officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the brim of his cap. He looked up slowly, meeting my gaze with an expression so hollow, so chilling, it sent ice through my veins. His lips twisted into a smile, that same twisted, mocking smile I'd seen on the tapes. My blood ran cold. It was him, my friend, oblivious to the danger, stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Thanks for coming so fast, officer," he said. "My friend here's really shaken up." The man nodded, stepping into the house with slow, deliberate movements, his gaze never leaving mine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. He was in a police uniform, but everything about him screamed that he wasn't one of them. This was part of his game, another twisted trick. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and dripping with a strange, almost mocking politeness. "I heard you've been having some trouble." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with a predatory glint. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I backed away, my heart pounding. You're not a cop," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His smile widened. "Aren't I?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made my stomach drop. A small VHS tape, identical to the ones I'd found in my grandmother's attic. He held it out to me, tilting his head in mock invitation. "How about we watch this together?" My friend looked between us, confused. What's going on?" he asked, looking to me for answers. But I had none to give him. The man's voice dropped to a whisper, his tone laced with something dark and malicious. "You shouldn't have watched the tapes. Now you're part of the story, and the story doesn't end until, well, you'll see." I felt trapped, cornered, like a mouse caught by a cat. Desperate, I looked to my friend, and before I knew what I was doing, I grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the door. "We need to go. Now." The man didn't stop us, just watched with that same eerie smile as we bolted out of the house, his laughter echoing behind us. We ran down the street, not stopping until we reached the nearest lit street corner. My friend was panting, confusion and fear etched across his face. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Who was that guy?" I shook my head, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. "I don't know," I whispered, feeling the weight of my words. "But I think he's been watching me for a long time." Just then, I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and saw a text from an unknown number. My heart dropped as I read the message. "You can't run forever. See you soon." I looked up, and in the dim light, my friend's face mirrored the horror I felt inside. There was no escaping him, no hiding from whatever this nightmare was. And somehow, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. My hands shook as I clutched my phone, staring at the message until the words seemed to blur and twist. I felt like I was slipping into a nightmare that refused to let me go. My friend looked at me, his face pale, his own fear barely concealed. We needed a plan, but how could we plan against someone who knew my every move? "We can't go back to my place," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "He's watching us. He's everywhere." My friend nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay, we won't. But we have to go somewhere, right? A police station, maybe." The thought was tempting, but something inside me balked at it. What if he was waiting for us there too? What if he had people working with him? I had no idea how deep this went. "No," I said, my voice firmer now. "No police. We can't trust anyone." He looked at me, conflicted, but nodded. "Okay, let's get to a place where we can think this through." He gestured toward his car, parked a few blocks away. We made our way to it, moving quickly but trying not to draw attention. Every step felt loaded with dread, each passing shadow a potential hiding spot for the man who seemed to know my every move. We got into the car, locking the doors behind us. My friend started the engine, glancing over at me. Where to? I thought for a moment, my mind racing. Somewhere crowded, I replied, trying to think like the man who was hunting me. He won't make a move if there are people around. Maybe a diner? My friend nodded and pulled out onto the street, heading toward a 24-hour diner on the other side of town. The silence in the car was heavy, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to piece together some explanation, some way to understand the nightmare that had become my life. After what felt like an eternity, we pulled into the parking lot of the diner. It was mostly empty, save for a couple of parked cars and a truck idling near the entrance. We hurried inside, choosing a booth in the far corner where we could see the door and windows. I sat down, pulling the notebook out of my bag. I hadn't let it out of my sight since we'd left my grandmother's house, feeling like it was the only anchor to the reality I was now trapped in. My friend leaned forward, watching as I opened it to the last page again, where those two words had been waiting for me, too late. I flipped through the pages again, hoping to find something I'd missed. As I reached the middle of the notebook, I stopped, my breath catching. There, on a page I was sure I'd seen before, were fresh notes, scribbled hastily, as if they'd been written in a rush. "You're not alone." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. Was this a message for me, or another of his games? My friend looked at the page, his eyes widening. "Wait, didn't you say that writing wasn't there before?" I nodded, unable to speak, and kept reading. Just below those words, there was another line, barely legible, scrawled as if someone had written it in a hurry. "The tapes are just the beginning. He wants more than just fear. He wants control, control." The word sent a chill down my spine. I thought back to the videos, the meticulous way he'd followed that woman, the way he'd seemed to manipulate every part of her life until he was the only thing she could think about, until he was everywhere. He didn't just want to frighten me. He wanted to own me, to make me part of whatever twisted story he'd been crafting all along. I flipped to the next page, my fingers trembling. More fresh words stared back at me, filling the page in messy, frantic handwriting. "There's only one way out. Find him before he finds you." The words echoed in my mind. Find him before he finds me. It sounded insane. How could I even think about confronting him? But something about the message felt real, like it was a lifeline being thrown into the darkness. My friend looked at me, his face set with determination. If this guy wants to play games, then maybe it's time we turn the tables. We find him, figure out who he is, and end this. I felt a surge of courage, small but enough to cling to. I nodded, gripping the notebook tighter. But where do we start? Just then, my phone vibrated again. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to check the screen. Another message from that same unknown number. "It's rude to keep me waiting." And then, a photo, a snapshot of the diner taken from outside, capturing me and my friend sitting in the booth. I looked up, my blood running cold, and there, through the diner window, I saw him. Standing in the parking lot, his face partially hidden under a hood, that same twisted smile staring right back at me. The sight of him outside the diner, that dark figure with the hood, the grin that stretched too wide, made my blood turn to ice. He didn't move, didn't wave or gesture, just stood there, watching me. It was as if he knew I would see him, knew I'd be paralyzed with fear. I turned to my friend, gripping his arm, my voice barely a whisper. "He's here, outside. He's watching us right now." My friend glanced at the window, and his face went pale. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Enough," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're not running anymore. We're gonna confront him, get some answers. This ends here." Before I could stop him, he stood up and walked toward the diner door, throwing a glance back at me as if to say, "Asterisk, stay here. I'll handle this." Asterisk. Every instinct screamed at me to tell him not to go. But I was frozen, my legs like lead as I watched him push through the door and step into the parking lot. I held my breath, watching through the glass as my friend approached the man. They were only a few feet apart, my friend's fists clenched, shoulders tense. I saw his mouth moving, asking questions, demanding answers. But the man, the shadow that had haunted my life, that knew every step I would take, simply smiled. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but my friend's face contorted with frustration. He was shouting now, his words lost to the thick glass between us. And still, the man remained calm, his grin never wavering, his eyes fixed on me through the diner window. Then, in one sudden, fluid motion, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small and metallic. The glint of a knife. My heart dropped. I scrambled out of the booth, running to the door, screaming for my friend to get back, to get away. But it was too late. The man lunged forward, the knife flashing in the streetlight, and in one swift motion, he slashed across my friend's arm. My friend stumbled back, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. The man took a step toward him, but as he did, his eyes shifted to me again, as if daring me to come closer to try to save my friend. "No!" I screamed, bolting out of the diner, not even feeling the cold as I rushed toward them. The man backed away, his grin never faltering. He tilted his head, almost mockingly, as he slipped the knife back into his coat. Then he pointed a single finger at me, slowly mouthing words I couldn't hear but understood all too well. "You're next." He turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing into the shadows before I could reach him. I fell to my knees beside my friend, who was clutching his arm, blood trickling through his fingers. He looked up at me, his face pale but determined. Are you okay?" I stammered, tears streaming down my face. He gave a weak nod, his face contorted in pain. "I'm fine," he said, wincing, "but we need to go. We can't stay here." I helped him up, casting one last glance into the shadows where the man had disappeared. A part of me expected him to reappear, to continue his sick game. But the darkness was empty, silent. He was gone for now. We stumbled back to the car, my friend's breathing shallow, his face pale. I tore a piece of fabric from my shirt, tying it tightly around his arm to stem the bleeding. My hands were trembling, my mind a blur of terror and confusion. What was this man's endgame? How did he know everything about me, about my life? As I settled back into the car, my friend weakly pressed his phone into my hand. "Here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. There's someone I know. Private investigator. If anyone can help us, it's him." I nodded, my hands shaking as I took the phone. The contact was already open, and I hit call, barely breathing as I waited for someone to answer. After a few rings, a deep voice crackled through the speaker. "Hello." I swallowed hard. Please, I need your help. There's someone following me. He knows everything about me. He's watching us." The voice on the other end paused for a moment, then replied calmly, "Tell me where you are. I'll be there as soon as I can. And listen carefully. Don't go anywhere alone. Stay in the light. And whatever you do, don't let him get inside your head." I hung up, my grip on the phone tight. It felt like a fragile thread, a thin lifeline in the storm of fear that had become my reality. As I put the phone down, another message lit up the screen. "You think he can save you? No one can." And then, a second message attached to a photo. I opened it with shaking hands. It was a picture of my grandmother's house. And in the photo, standing just outside her front door, was me. Standing frozen, watching as the man with the twisted smile walked up the steps, inching closer and closer to her. The blood drained from my face as I stared at the photo. It was a picture of something that hadn't happened yet. A moment I hadn't lived through. I was still here, in the diner parking lot, my friend slumped next to me, clutching his injured arm. But there, in that photo, was a future version of me, helplessly watching as the man approached my grandmother's house. It felt like a warning, a sick, twisted premonition of what was to come. I shoved my phone into my pocket, breathing hard. "We have to get to my grandmother's. Now." My friend looked up at me, weak but resolute. "Are you sure? If he's waiting there..." "I don't care," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "He's threatening her. If this guy wants me, fine. But I'm not letting him hurt my family." With my friend leaning on me, We got into his car and sped through the empty streets. Every shadow, every dark corner felt like it could be hiding him. My mind replayed that photo again and again, trying to make sense of how he had it, how he knew what I'd do before I even did it. We pulled up to my grandmother's house, and I noticed that her lights were on. Relief washed over me. She was awake. Maybe she'd heard us coming and had locked the doors. Maybe she'd be ready. I parked in the driveway, helping my friend out of the car, and we made our way to the front door. But as we approached, I realized something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar. I froze, dread filling my veins. There was no way my grandmother would leave the door open this late at night. I glanced back at my friend, who gave me a grim nod, his hand gripping a tire iron he'd taken from the car. We pushed the door open, stepping quietly inside. The house was dead silent, the only sound our own shallow breaths. My heart pounded as I called out, "Grandma?" No answer. We moved further in, the shadows swallowing us as we tiptoed through the familiar rooms. It was surreal, walking through this place I'd known all my life, feeling like a stranger in my own memory. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch, my eyes scanning every corner, every inch of darkness. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard it, the faintest whisper, just a few words, spoken in that same low, mocking tone that had haunted my nightmares. "Welcome home." I gripped my friend's arm, motioning him to stay quiet. We moved toward the sound, each step feeling like it brought me closer to some inevitable, horrifying end. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if he were taunting us, daring us to find him. "Is this what you wanted?" We reached the living room, and there, standing in the middle of the room, was the man himself. He looked just as he had in the videos, the same twisted smile, the same cold, calculating eyes. But this time he was holding something, a small, old-fashioned camera, its lens pointed directly at us. In his other hand, he held my grandmother's necklace, the one she never took off, dangling like a trophy. I swallowed, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Where is she?" I demanded, taking a step forward. He tilted his head, that sick smile widening. "Oh, don't worry. She's safe for now. But you? You're exactly where I want you." He raised the camera, his finger hovering over the shutter. My friend moved forward, brandishing the tire iron, his face twisted in fury. "You stay away from her. You hear me?" The man only laughed, a low, chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, I'll be seeing you both, very soon." And then, before either of us could react, he pressed the shutter. The flash was blinding, and for a split second, everything went white. I blinked, disoriented, reaching out to steady myself. But when my vision cleared, the man was gone. The room was empty, as if he'd never been there. My friend looked at me, his face pale, the tire iron slipping from his grip. What just happened? I glanced down, noticing a small slip of paper on the floor where he'd stood. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a photograph still warm from the camera flash. It showed me and my friend, standing in the very spot we were in now, our faces twisted in horror as we stared at him, the man with that terrible smile standing right behind us. The caption beneath it read, "See you soon." The sight of that photo, our terrified faces frozen in time, the man's leering presence hovering right behind us, shattered something inside me. This entire nightmare had felt like a trap, and now, holding that last chilling photograph, I knew he had been orchestrating every single step. And still, he was out there, watching, waiting for his next move. I crumpled the photo in my fist, turning to my friend. "We have to end this, right now. No more running." My friend, pale and shaken, nodded. "What's the plan?" I took a deep breath, feeling a new, desperate courage burn within me. He's playing this game to control us, but he's just a man. We have to find him before he finds us again. My friend agreed, and we left my grandmother's house, leaving no room for second thoughts. We drove through the darkened streets, following every instinct, every familiar corner where he might be hiding. And then, like a dark blessing, I saw it. The shadow of a figure standing on the edge of a nearby lot, just outside an abandoned building. My friend parked a safe distance away. We got out of the car, adrenaline coursing through us. The man, waiting in the shadows, turned to face us, that twisted smile already set on his face. He didn't run. He knew we were coming, knew this would be the final chapter he'd been crafting for so long. "Well, you finally found me," he called out, his voice taunting and hollow, echoing off the empty walls of the lot. "Now what?" Without hesitating, I stepped forward, my voice stronger than I expected. "It's over. You don't get to haunt me anymore. This is where it ends." He let out a laugh, a sound so cold it felt like ice slicing through the night air. "Is that what you think? You're my masterpiece, you know. I've crafted every fear, every move you've made. This ends only when I say it does." But I didn't flinch. He had terrorized me, controlled my every step, pushed me to the edge. But something had changed. I wasn't the same person who'd found those tapes. I wasn't afraid anymore. "You're nothing," I said, my voice steady. "You're just a coward hiding behind a camera." He smirked, taking a step forward, but I didn't move. I met his gaze, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my fear. In that instant, his smile faltered. He realized he'd lost his power over me. My friend stepped beside me, holding his ground, his voice firm. "Leave, and don't come back." The man's expression shifted, his confidence cracking, his grin fading. I could see it, the doubt, the fear he'd always masked with his games. He looked at us, no longer in control, and took a step back, his eyes darting around, as if searching for a way out. He turned, slipping back into the darkness, his shadow melting away into the night. For the first time, he was the one running. We stood there, watching him disappear, the heavy silence settling around us. I felt the weight of all the fear, all the terror he'd put me through, begin to lift. It was over. Back at my friend's car, we sat in silence, the weight of everything finally catching up to us. There was no celebratory relief, no joyful end to this nightmare, only the hollow satisfaction of survival. I knew he might be out there somewhere, but he no longer held control over me. Days passed and life slowly returned to normal. My grandmother was safe, my friend healed, and I began to move on, leaving the horrors of that man and his tapes behind. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, just in case. Because even though the nightmare was over, his smile lingered in my memory, a dark reminder that sometimes fear doesn't disappear. It simply fades, waiting in the shadows. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd find myself reaching for the light, just to be sure he wasn't there, watching.